Hi, I'm Bob Corbis. I'm talking to Jim Gochenaur today, and he was telling us about when he got a ride home from Secret Service agent Elmer Moore. Jim's conversations in the 1970s with Secret Service agent Elmer Moore put him on a path of research in the Kennedy assassination that ultimately had him testifying before the Church Committee, which is the predecessor to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. So Jim told us the story about how he got a ride home from Elmer Moore, and in our last conversation we kind of ended it there, so we want to pick it up there. So Jim, welcome.
Thank you, Bob.
Okay, you were just telling us about the ride you got home from Elmer Moore. What happened after that?
Well, the property that I rented had a long backyard, and so we walked across the backyard to the rear porch, and standing on the porch was my wife at the time, Marie, and her sister Tina, who was living with us at that residence. And I introduced.
So he came in the alley? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, he parked his car in the alley, and then we walked the sidewalk all the way through the yard.
Was that just a better place to access the house from, or something?
Well, 23rd Avenue Northeast at that time, you couldn't park on either side.
Oh.
So I told him that as we approached the address.
I see.
And we went up an alley and then by the garage there.
I see.
He parked his car. And we walked along a walk that went from the garage area to the rear porch, and my wife Marie and her sister Tina were there. I introduced them, and I said to Elmer, listen, I'll tell you what, I've got a ceramic studio in the basement. I'd like to show you what I've been doing with that. And he said, oh yeah, I'd love to see that. So we went through the kitchen area, and in the kitchen there was a crib for a 9-month-old baby, Shona, that we had, that Marie and I were parents of. And Marie picked up Shona and introduced Shona to Elmer. And Elmer had to pick her up, and he's, oh, a cute little girl, and wiggled his finger on her cheek, and she giggled and everything like that. And he said, yeah, I've got 3 daughters, and do you have any other children? And she said, no. And said, well, are you going to expand your family? And Marie sort of said, well, I got my hands full at this point. So all of us, including Shona, who was in my ex-wife's arms, went down into the basement, and I proceeded to go to the potter's wheel that I had down there and throw a fairly large bowl for Elmer.
Really? So the material's all ready to go?
Right. The only thing that I didn't have there was a kiln. Mm-hmm. I had all the greenware and everything drying on shelves and things like that, some ceramic sculpture. And then I'd have a friend of mine transport it when I was ready to have it fired down to the university where I was being a student and practice teaching. Moore was very fascinated with it. He says, my wife loves pots, and he said maybe you should teach me how to do that so that I can, cut the cost of my family buying all these ceramics.
Uh-huh.
I said, I'd be willing to do that. I said, by the way, there is a arts and crafts show where I'm going to be setting up in Kirkland, which was a suburb of Seattle at the time, in July, which was just coming up. And he says, I'll show up with my wife Marion and see what kind of material you have. And I said, great. I gave him a sheet that was the brochure for it. And then we walked upstairs and we went out the door. And as we were walking back towards the car, Moore stopped me. He pulled on my arm and he drew me closer and he says, Jim, your wife looks just like Marina Oswald.
Uh-huh.
Of all the stunning statements that he made, that one was right up there too. I mean, I didn't consider it that she looked like Marina Oswald. And then for some reason, Elmer starts talking about the rocky relationship between Lee Oswald and his wife Marina.
Oh, really? Uh-huh.
He said, "Oh yeah, he was very brutal with her. He beat her all the time." And I didn't know that at that time.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, wow, he looks like a kind of a puny guy. I mean, it didn't register with me that he would be a wife beater. But he went on about it,
Uh-huh.
And he was walking up there, and as we got into the car, he got into the car, he had the door open, and we continued the conversation. And he said, "Jim, have you ever considered a career in law enforcement?" And I said, "Well, I think my uncle had asked me that question." And he says, "Well, if you're interested, I think you might be interested in a career in the Secret Service, and if you wanted to do that, I could help you."
That's amazing, isn't it?
It is. And again, from the time that I met him face to face the first time until right up to that point, the conversations that we had, I was totally unprepared for. Very difficult for me to respond very much the way I would normally want to respond. I was just sort of shocked, about some of the things that he would say.
Yeah.
And we continued to talk, and he said, "This case is like everything else in life. Follow the money." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he says, "Here we are, the Secret Service is part of the Treasury Department, and we couldn't follow the money."
Uh-huh.
And I was going to say, "Well, where did you want to look?" And I didn't get that far. And then he said something to the effect, "Well, it was like most cases that I've been involved in, the simplest solution is the best solution."
Right. So let me ask you a question. Let me back up a little. When he says, "Here we are, the Treasury Department, and we can't follow the money," did he ever elaborate on that? I mean, why couldn't they follow the money?
He left that pretty well dangling, and I was considering asking him, well, is it you couldn't follow the money because you were told not to follow the money, or it was so complex that you couldn't devote the manpower for it?
Okay, you never got an answer. Yeah.
I never got that far, but I felt that would be a great starting point for if I can continue to talk with the guy.
Mm-hmm.
I was worried that the only way to continue talking with him is if I agreed to, become a Secret Service agent. That was going through my mind.
It's funny because at this time you had long hair. You were like a hippie, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I looked like a crazed rock band man.
So you went from two guys who thought you were at odds with each other to him inviting you to join the.
Yeah, it was like. It was sort of like some sort of mental Novocaine that was surging through me when he would come up with these statements. Mm-hmm. Now, the money thing was very interesting, and then he went on to say that, there's a few people that would have to pass away before this case could be, expanded upon. And again, I was trying to think, well, how can I phrase a question, retort to that? And then he just interjected to the thing and said that, it's unacceptable to think that, it can't be solved. But he said, legally, this case will never be solved. And then I said, right off the bat, I said, well, Chief Justice Warren said that for 75 years, things are going to be under lock and key. Do you think that the case could be exposed and brought out in the air, so to speak, after the 75 years? And he said, no, nothing of substance would be there. He didn't think.
Uh-huh.
And again, I was really let down and disappointed that he didn't expand upon that in the conversation. And he closed the door, and he looked out and he says, Jim, I want you to promise me that you won't let this become an obsession. And I said, well, I'll try. And then he drove off.
That's weird. That's an unusual thing to say.
It totally is. And the entire first face-to-face meeting I had with him ranged so incredibly, I should say that it went from one extreme to another, and for some reason I couldn't form questions in response to it. But on the other hand, I was absorbing a lot of what he was saying.
Right.
And I could tell that this man knew a lot more than what he was saying, but I was surprised that he gave me as much as he did.
Which is probably why you couldn't formulate questions, because you never expected the conversation to go where it went, right?
Right, and
what did you expect the conversation? Did you expect him to go, Oswald did it, and that's the end of it? Or?
Well, I fully expected on the first thing that he would sort of laugh me out of the office because of my appearance.
Yeah.
But no, that didn't seem to affect him.
Uh-huh.
And then I think as I was asking the questions in a kind of a logical progression, that he decided that he would try to answer the questions as best he could without violating his oath that he said he took about this case.
Yeah.
My feeling as it developed is that he was signaling that he would like to continue the conversation. My idea is, at that point, by the time he drove off, I have to get into the house and start writing this down because he wouldn't let me take notes.
Oh, so you did have the presence of mind to say, I got to get remember.
Yeah, I went right back into the house and I started, doing some note writing, and I was trying to remember it, and I was doing it on the basis of what the professor at Whitewater in English, a course that I had to take to get to a bachelor's degree in English, and the guy that taught it was Dr. Ben Collins, and Collins was actually teaching journalism. So I got squeezed into a journalism class in lieu of not being able to find an English class, as they put it.
Oh, really?
And so one of the things that Collins had us do is he would give the students that he had, including myself, assignments. We'd go and interview people. And one of the things that he came up with is that if you can't take notes, that you find some means of trying to remember significant things by using time, like you're looking at your watch. Or, if not, if you couldn't look at your watch, maybe a color or something that comes associative in
Do
it.
some association, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I think it worked fairly well. There are gaps in my memory, but not many.
All right, so let me ask you about that. You went and wrote some notes down. Do you still have those notes?
I do not.
What happened to them?
When I was subpoenaed for the church committee, which was actually the Schweiker committee.
Right, and it just don't go into too much detail because we're going to do a whole interview about that.
Well, what happened
to the notes, though?
I used the notes to make a summary. They asked me to write a summary of my conversations with Elmer Moore.
Okay.
At some point after I gave him that summary, those notes were lost. And I think it was constantly in transit between one apartment and another. I don't think there was anything nefarious about it, but I just couldn't find it. And
They just got thrown out probably in the move.
Yeah, ironically, I didn't have a satchel like Moore did, but I had a fairly large briefcase that I kept a lot of those notes in.
Okay, so that's interesting. So we can end it there, but that's very interesting. Moore's leaving now, and you're running in to try to remember what this incredible conversation you had with him. What do we want to talk about maybe in the next interview?
I think we want to talk about the Kirkland encounter, which was shortest of them all, but probably most interesting.
Okay, but that's kind of like the next
Right.
chronological
Yeah,
interaction.
right,
before.
right. This was May. It was May 7th, 1971. In July 19th, 71 was the Kirkland Fair.
Okay, so there's a couple months before. Did you talk to him on the phone in between that, or?
What had
In that
happened was
2-month
is that
period,
he
or?
called me a couple of times and asked if I'd considered, his offer to help me get into the Secret
Really?
Service.
Wow.
Yeah, and I said, well, my wife at the time, Marie, was saying, hey, listen, you put this money into this. We've traveled out 1,000-some miles for you to pursue a teaching career in art. You really want to do that? And so I was conflicted.
Mm.
I mean, I liked both ideas.
Yeah.
And I kept on putting more off when I was talking, like he did with me, I guess, about that. I said that by the Kirkland Fair I would have a definite answer.
Okay, so then on the next interview we'll talk about the Kirkland Fair.
Yeah,
Cool. All right. Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it.
sure, no problem.
Okay.